Okay, today we were going to look at this farm here that we know as the Rose Farm here at Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. It was a farm that was surrounded on July 2nd, 1863 by the Union and Confederate armies and fought through and over. Now, the farm itself was built in the year 1811, and it had a log barn on the property. The house, as you see it today, was completed in 1824 with a barn that we'll take a look at a little bit later that was built in the year 1812. Now, the estate was sold by the Sherfy family to Jacob Benner in 1844. Benner, who had been the legal guardian of two of Sherfy's grandsons, purchased the two-story house with a porch, a thatched log building, a stone bank barn, a wagon shed, a corn crib, a carriage house, a stone wash house, and a log stable. Now, the acreage included an apple, peach, and pear orchards with 140 acres of timber and meadow. Now, Benner paid $5,316 for the property, which was surveyed at 312 acres, 113 purchase, which is about $17 an acre. In need of farm labor, Benner hired his neighbor, Philip Snyder, who was the son of a local property owner named Philip Snyder. The Benners removed the log building next to the farmhouse and replaced it with a 1.5-story stone house, which you see here today, which appears on the 1852 tax assessment records. Now, during the ownership of the property, Benner sold 8 acres to John Houck, 39 acres to the partnership of Houck and McCreary, 3 acres to George Wilson in the year 1844, 13 acres to David Essick in 1845, 7 acres to local John T. Weichert, and 9 acres to John Wentz in 1847, which accounted and alienated 80 acres from the farm. In 1858, the Benners sold their farm and bought a house and lot in the borough of Gettysburg. On March 22nd, 1858, George and Dorothy Rose of Germantown, Pennsylvania, which is near Philadelphia, bought a 230-acre farm, which was the Rose Farm, for $8,050. In 1861, John R. Rose occupied the property. Now, there is some uncertainty that exists because John claimed that he moved into this farmhouse on April the 1st, 1863, but the 1860 census places him and his family here in Gettysburg, not in Germantown. And no evidence suggests that John Rose ever owned his own property. Now, February 28th, 1859, the Gettysburg Compiler noted the first cattle shipment by railroad last Thursday by Mr. Rose, suggesting that one of the brothers occupied the property within a year of the purchase. Now, according to the 1860 census, the John Rose family consisted of John, his wife Elizabeth, 7 children, 3 which were under the age of 10, and 4 teenagers, the 2 eldest of whom were his daughters. The census also listed the elderly Elizabeth Lippincott as a domestic, a young Martha Welsh as help, 50-year-old John Miller as a farmhand, and 14-year-old Eli Leach as a hireling on the Rose Farm. By the time the battle happened, a professional tenant farmer, Francis Ogden, who was 44 years old, his wife, and a son, Charles, 17 years old, was listed as a laborer, and 3 younger sons lived on the Rose Farm, probably sharing the farmhouse. The arrangement between the Rose brothers allowed John to live on the property rent-free and provided George with a 50% interest in all the crops. Ogden was given a full right to 2 of the wheat fields, not the famous one, with 2 wheat fields that were on the property outside of the house, on the southern eastern side. Now, in August 1862, Charles F. Ogden, whose name or initials rather, CFO, is carved into one of the stones on the farmhouse, joined Captain John F. McCreary's Company B, 138th Pennsylvania Infantry, and went off to war. As war reached his home, there may have been up to 7 adults and 11 children living in the Rose farmhouse. Now we are looking at the barn here. Again, this barn was built in the year 1812, and it does have some rock carvings that we will stop and take a look at. This barn was destroyed, or the roof was destroyed in a windstorm rather, in 1934, and then it went into disarray and collapsed amongst itself. Inside there where you see the stones, they were actually numbered so that they could eventually be placed back. And here's one of the rock carvings that we talk about that's on the side of the barn. And we're going to walk around the barn here all the way around. The other side is where the bank of the barn rather is. And again, this barn goes back to the year 1812. So the stones that you're looking at right now were all placed here in the year 1812. All right. So we are coming up onto the side of the barn that's facing the Emmitsburg Road. And right here, you can see the bank of the original 1812 Rose barn. And then you can see the Rose farmhouse there in the distance. And now we'll walk along the final side of the wall and take a look at 2 other rock carvings. Again, today the Park Service has placed up a temporary fence because the walls of the barn are not very stable, and they want people to keep away from potential collapsing rocks. So here we go, and as we get here to this final corner, I'm going to take a look at 2 more carvings here that are well known. One is HHW, July 19th, 1886, and there it is again, HH Wirt, W-E-R-T. And of course we know that the Wirt family was well known here in Gettysburg. This has been a look at the Rose Farm barn. John Rose attempted to sell his household belongings in 1875, but it appears that the sale did not occur. He later sold those items and moved back to Philadelphia, where he appeared in the city directory beginning in 1879. Records do not appear to indicate what became of the Ogden family or how long they maintained their association with the Rose family. George Rose, who had lived at the farm in 1868, returned to Germantown in 1875. His financial history is traced in detail through a series of mortgages, but little else is known about him or his wife other than he passed away from stomach cancer on January the 12th, or rather January the 20th, 1882. Now, the Rose Farm was mired in debt and mortgage agreements, especially after the American Civil War. In 1861, George Rose placed the farm in the trust of James R. Toole for $1, while the terms of the trust gave Dorothy Rose near absolute control and responsibility for the farm, suggesting that Rose was sheltering the farm from creditors. Rose attempted to sell his farm in May of 1866 and again in August, but could not find a buyer for the farm. At the time, he was $338 in debt and took out a mortgage on his Gettysburg farm. A trend of mortgaging the farm, paying a debt, getting more debt, and then mortgaging the farm again seemed to recur for the remainder of Rose's ownership, as he had not less than 7 creditors. In the year 1867, creditors won a judgment against Rose in court, but he managed to pay it off and save the farm. However, in 1871, the Adams County Sheriff seized the property to pay Rose's debt. But despite the 2 notices, the property did not sell. In 1873, another creditor obtained a writ of alias exponus, and the sheriff seized the Rose Farm again. A public sale conveyed the deed to Charles Hagee after he paid the court a remarkably pitiful sum of $100. Records don't indicate whether this was the full purchase price, but only that $100 was sufficient enough to give Hagee possession of the deed. In the following year, Hagee sold a 50% interest in the farm to the Roses, and a year later, another buyer was found. On March the 25th, 1875, Charles Hagee and George and Dorothy Rose, with James R. Toole as the trustee, sold the Rose Farm to Rosanna Weibel for $9,000. A month and a half later, George and Dorothy Rose bought the property back for $9,000. The Rose Farm had 5 owners between the Rose family and the National Park Service over 100 years. Rosanna Weibel owned the Rose Farm while her husband William was assessed the taxes. The 1880 census gave William's age as 54 and Rosanna's as 52. They had a ready supply of labor in the form of 6 sons, ages 27, 21, 19, 17, 14, and 10, along with a 12-year-old daughter. Weibel had been in the farm machinery business. He was a deacon in the Lutheran Church, school director, master mason, and finally a farmer. During their ownership, the Weibels transferred the 58 acres to the Gettysburg Battlefield Memorial Association, the first land preservation entity at Gettysburg, a precursor to the National Park Service, which included the wheat field, a part of Rose Grove, and the immediate surroundings. They also turned to the morass, which was a low, marshy area northeast of the farmhouse alongside the wheat field and Stony Hill, into a pond stocked with German carp. And a lot of photographs you can find online. There is a photograph of this German carp stock pond. It was also during the Weibel ownerships that the Gettysburg Electric Railway created railroad beds for a trolley line that passed right by the Rose Farm. Now, a man named J. Emery Bear, who was a cashier for the Gettysburg National Bank, and he was also a receiver for the Gettysburg Springs Hotel Company, he was frequently involved in land transactions, and his name appeared on a number of mortgages as a witness or creditor. Bear sold land to the Park Commission, the land preservation entity which replaced the GBMA and preceded the National Park Service, as a businessman and as a private owner. He sold the land necessary to create Burney Avenue, which is around the Peach Orchard, to the Park Commission, followed by 32 acres of Rhodes Woods in 1905 for $2,850. Additionally, Bear removed the Weibel Pond and may have changed the location of smaller outbuildings. In April of 1908, Mary C. Bear petitioned to the Orphans' Court to appoint her as her husband's guardian because illness prevented him from managing the property. The court, with both Bears present, consented, and a year later allowed Mary to sell the 139-acre farm that he owed to pay debts. During the 1909 sale of the property, it was discovered that Bear has only a 50% owner. The other was W. W. Hafer, who had died a few years earlier. Hafer's estate sold his 50% interest to Maggie Weibel, who also bought Bear's 50% interest on April the 16th, 1909 for $2,004.47. So you can see from the time of the Civil War, before the Civil War, up to 1909, the amount of complication as went on in the ownership of the Rose Farm. Now, Maggie Weibel, who was the wife of David Weibel, was the daughter of William and Rosanna Weibel, the first Weibels that owned the Rose Farm. Maggie secured $4,000 mortgage at a 5% interest rate from Harriet S. Toot, which was satisfied in 1919 to pay for the property. The Weibel sold 15 acres, which we today know as the Loop or the Stony Hill, to the Park Commission in 1910. Late in her tenure on the property, Maggie considered selling the barn to the school district as a foundation stone after the windstorm blew the roof off. However, the National Park Service successfully lobbied her to change her mind. In 1937, unable to keep the farm as a widow and in the midst of economic disaster, Maggie Weibel sold the farm to John A. and Ann Alston of Dayton, Ohio. The Alstons secured a $2,000 mortgage to the Gettysburg National Bank and a mortgage of $850 to Maggie Weibel, payable in annual increments of at least $100. The Alstons never resided at the farm, choosing instead to rent the property out. Cumberland Township records show that the last renter was an adjacent landowner named A. Hutchinson. In 1946, after her husband's death, Ann Alston sold the Rose Farm again. Gettysburg natives, the Reverend Luther and Matilda Slifer, purchased the remnants of the Rose Farm in 1946. They acquired 50 acres along with a $5,000 mortgage from Miss Alston and a $4,000 mortgage from the Gettysburg National Bank. Frequently abroad, as in international missionaries, the Silfers did not occupy the farm until 1962, but rented it out to friends and relatives. Amongst the changes the Slifers made to the house, they added bathrooms on the first and second floors and installed the large windows on the south side of the first floor. In 1958, the Slifers sold 24-acre and 24-acre tracts of the farm located on the north and south side of the farm entrance lane. In 1969, they sold the remaining 6 acres to the National Park Service with a life estate, which allowed the Slifers to remain in the house until they deceased. In 1979, upon Reverend Slifer's death, the farmhouse became the property of the Gettysburg National Military Park, in which it has remained ever since. Now, on this final look here at the Rose Farm, I want to focus a little bit on the surrounding property. Now, of course, on July 2nd of 1863, Confederate brigades passed through this farm on their way over to places like the wheat field, over toward the Stony Hill, and then, of course, on the outskirts of Devil's Den. This was a massive farm. Like I said, built in 1811 with original log structure. And it was several hundred yards. And there in the distance where you see that large tree in the center, that was actually the aftermath of the battle, where a lot of the dead from the Rose Farm, in which I did a video called The Rose Farm Dead, those photographs were taken back there. And this farm, the Rose Farm, is considered to be the bloodiest farm in all of the American Civil War. Of course, it was filled with beautiful fruit orchards, and they had cattle and straw and hay, and the property it was bordered. It's several hundred yards from the Emmitsburg Road all the way out toward the Sherfy Peach Orchard, and over toward the wheat field and, the Roses Woods behind the house. Again, this was a massive farm, and as I had mentioned in an earlier video, a man named John Slider, who lived along the Emmitsburg Road. In just a moment, I'll zoom in on his house. It'll be in the center of the screen. His son actually worked here on this farm. Let's pan over here. And in the center of my screen, you're going to see a house. That is the John Slider house right along the Emmitsburg Road. So his son worked here as a worker on this farm. So that's looking at the southern end of the farm. And then over in this direction, beyond these orchard trees, would have been the Sherfy farm. Okay, so imagine yourself back in the early 1800s. You got this 200 and so acre farm. It took a lot of people to operate. And that's why in the first video I went through who lived here and, on what years they lived here. And often there were 7, 10, 12 people living in this house. Of course, this house was a log house. Then in 1824, it was converted to a stone house that was 1.5 stories. And then it had been expanded on a couple times through the years, because at most times 10, 12 or more people were living here on this farm. So as we walk around the back side of the farm, we're going to look at some of the features of the land on the outskirts of the farm. We're also going to look at some of the buildings, and you'll see here some of the outbuildings. Again, there was a summer kitchen, a stone wash house, and other outbuildings which the Park Service has been able to recreate as to the best of their ability here. And again, it was a good thing that this farm got into the hands of the National Park Service by 1979, because through the years, with the many different ownerships and all the foreclosures and such, this farm had went into a state of disrepair and dilapidation. And so finally in 1979, when it becomes a part of the National Park Service, it's preserved, and it will be preserved for as long as there's a Gettysburg National Military Park. And then the distance there, that was the Sherfy Peach Orchard. So that farm stretched all the way out there. Now we're walking along the back side or the rear of the house now, getting another view at some of these outbuildings. And you'll see the 2-story house, which was originally a 1.5-story house, and some of the outbuildings. We began this video from the front of the house looking at the porch, which when we get over to the house, you'll see the porch on the left side of our camera. This is part of the Gettysburg National Military Park, but also a place where people reside. So if you do decide to come out here and visit, and you come up the driveway, look for a car, see if you can get permission, as I have done, to come over here and take pictures. You see the porch on the left side now? That's where we started our film. And as I said, through the years, later on, as different owners owned it, they actually built a pond, which they were stocked with German carp. And that was right where we're looking at now, that brushed area here, just to the right side of the Stony Hill, which we'll take a look at here in a second there. That is the Stony Hill, and just beyond that is the Bloody Wheat Field, and then panning over toward the Sherfy farm. And now we're back here at the barn, and I want to talk about some of the rock carvings. There's a lot of rock carvings on this barn. Some of them are more legible than others. There is one on the house that was CFO Charles Francis Ogden, who was a son of a tenant farmer that lived in the house during the battle in 1863. This one says HHI. Over here, there's one that can be read, and I didn't get mention this, PJB, it looks like. Some of these I really don't know the meaning. Now, the stones that you see in the center, that was part of the collapse of the foundation between 1934 and 1969. There was a large windstorm in 1934 that caved in the roof of this barn. And then the walls began to weaken without the structure, the roof and beams, and they began to cave inward on the barn. And as we walk around here, this is going to be what was the front or the bank of this Pennsylvania bank barn. You can see the bank there. Well, these stones, actually, when they did cave in, the Park Service actually painted numbers on them, because I guess a plan at one point was to try to put them back where they belong, maybe rebuild the foundation of the barn, at least, if not the entire barn, and that did not happen. And as of today, you can see there's a greenish colored plastic fence that surrounds this, keeping people away, because the structure could be unstable and could collapse, and they don't want anybody to get hurt. So the ones that we're going to look at on the final corner it's going to say H.H. Wirt, and then it's going to have a date of July 18th, 1888. He was born in Harrisburg in 1870, so he was 18 years old at the time of the battle. And he was the son of John Howard Wirt, who was a witness of the aftermath. There's HHW, and then it has the date, and then underneath HH Wirt, same person. He was the son of John Howard Wirt, who was an eyewitness to the aftermath of the battle. And in 1906, he wrote in a series of articles about the Rose Farm. And it is possible that Henry Howard Wirt, who was also known as Howard Wirt, may have worked here around the time of the William Weibel ownership of the farm. So again, I hope you enjoyed this video of the Rose Farm. I also did a video on the aftermath with the dead bodies at the southern end of the property, which I'll post and which you'll want to go back to watch. Feel free to comment with any questions that you have about this video series. And once again, I thank you for watching. This has been The Rose Farm by historian Frank Patrick Marone Jr. here on Gettysburg Historic Walking Tour. Standing here on the Rose Farm, and I'm looking direct center at the Rose Farm house. And we did a video series earlier on the Rose Farm house, the barn, and the outbuildings. This series is going to be called The Rose Farm Dead, and it's going to be in reference to a disturbing set of images that was taken just a few days after the Battle of Gettysburg of dead Confederate soldiers here on the southern end of the Rose Farm. And these photographs are some of the most disturbing ever taken of the American Civil War. Now, during the Battle of Gettysburg in July of 1863, brigades under Kershaw, Sims, and Anderson came right here across the Rose Farm southern end fields into that direction over to the wheat field. And in the aftermath of this battle, the dead were gathered here at the Rose Farm and arrayed for burial. And the images that were taken on those days have become some of the most disturbing. And what we're going to do in this video series is we're actually going to take you to the sites of where these 12 images were taken and show you what they look like today. Now, we're going to have these images by number, and the first numbered image was an image called Confederate Dead at the southwestern edge of the Rose Woods, a Gibson Gardner stereo view, view number 240, around July 5th or 6th of 1863. And as I walk over to the site that the image was taken, I'll show the modern view, and then I will also bring out the original negative and put it on the screen. Now, view 105 was shot about from an angle like this. And this image actually depicted a line of dead Confederate soldiers next to a large tree. Of course, the tree doesn't exist. And in the distance on the photograph, you could actually see a headboard or a grave. And this is what this image looks like today. So the photographer set up his camera right here in this spot and took image 240, which is taken right here in this angle. Then it appears, as the photographer began to notice the dead here at Gettysburg, that he then moved in this direction over here and moved his camera. And we're going to walk today over to the site of the next image. Slightly uphill, and I'm sure as the photographer got right here into this area on July 5th and 6th of 1863 that he noticed an array of dead bodies all across these fields here, which he then determined that he would strike those images. The photographer then set his camera up with his tripod about right here and took image number 106. And that image was called Confederate Dead, also at the southwestern edge of the Rosewoods, also a Gibson Gardner stereo view, number 246 that was taken on July 5th and 6th of 1863. And it showed a line of bodies right here. And in the distance, there used to be a rock, and that rock was actually stolen around 1987 to 1988. And this was the site of that second view. The next view was one of the most disturbing of all views during the American Civil War. And it appears after taking the first view there and the second view here that the cameraman then moved his camera into this direction. Again, this is just 2 or 3 days after the Battle of Gettysburg. And the cameraman set up his camera in this area right here. And the first photograph he took was of a dead Confederate soldier in the field at the southwestern edge of the Rosewoods, which was an O'Sullivan plate on July 5th of 1863. The camera was actually tilted down in this direction, and this was a depiction of a soldier that had his entire midsection blown out, which at that time was thought to have been struck by an artillery. And it was later determined most likely that the midsection missing, or his entire bowels missing, was the act of wild hogs here on the Gettysburg battlefield that were feeding on these bodies. And then, of course, what had happened after this was that same photographer actually tilted the tripod up in this direction and took a view of that same exact soldier, but with the background in the distance. And that view would be view number 274, which was also named Dead Confederate Soldier in the Field at the southwestern edge of the Rosewoods, a Gardner stereo number 274. This has been the Rose Farm Dead, Part 1 on Gettysburg Battlefield Facebook. Part 2 on Gettysburg Battlefield Facebook. And we just took a look at the two slightly different images of the Confederate soldier with his entire midsection that was hollowed out. Again, most likely by hogs, wild hogs, here on the Gettysburg battlefield, July 5th and 6th, 1863. The photographers then moved their camera back into this direction and took their next view, which was view or stereo number 235. Now this stereo was called Confederate Dead at the southwestern edge of the woods, view looking toward the split rock, which was a Gardner image. And in this image, and this is probably one of the most popular images of the Gettysburg battlefield dead, and the image depicts a set of bodies taken from about this angle right here. And in this image, you can actually see bodies leaning up against this rock here. Also, you can see them in front of these two rocks in the distance back here. But the most distinctive thing about this view is the identification of this boulder back here that has a large split in it. This boulder was later popularized by historian William Frazenito as the Frazenito Split Rock, and it was put in his early photography at Gettysburg at Journey in Time books in the early 1970s. And this was also the key to identifying all the bodies, because it was noticed that the same bodies that were in this image also were taken from other angles. And then when you would go over to those angles, you would see the bodies that were taken at our earlier sites up in here. So it was able to determine that the photographers moved around this south part of the field ever so slightly and took images from different angles. This, again, was the image
entitled Confederate Dead at the Southwestern Edge of the Rose Woods, View Looking Toward the Eastward Toward the Split Rock, a Gardner stereo view number 235. The cameraman then moved his camera over into this area. And took two views at very close range. The first view he took was from this angle about right here. And this view showed several Confederate bodies here, and then a couple right up against this rock here. And this was image number 110 in Bill Frazanito's book. He then moved his camera slightly over here and took a second view. But in the second view he took, he only focused on the few bodies that were leaning up against the rock, which was shown in the view that we talked about just before. In Bill Frazanito's book, that is view number 111, if you have that book. Now, view 10 was called Confederate Dead at the Southwest Edge of the Rose Farm, View Looking Southwestward Toward the Bushman Ridge. Now, Bushman Ridge is over here. It was also titled the same thing for view 257. So, view 239 was here. 257 was taken from about this angle here. This has been the Rose Farm Dead Part 2. Our images number 268 and 256. And they're both entitled Confederate Dead at the Southwestern Edge of the Rosewoods, View Looking Northwestward Toward the Sherfy Peach Orchard. It was a Gardner stereo. Again, number 268 and 256, probably taken July 5th or 6th of 1863. Now, in that first view, 268, it was taken right here in this position. And if you look at the photograph, you can actually see this rock, the dead Confederate soldiers right here in the distance. And actually, one of them has his knee sticking up. Then as you look in the distance up here on the horizon of the hill, you actually notice the photographer's wagon. Gardner's wagon is up here at the top of the hill. So we do know where he originated and brought his wagon from. And this is a very significant, not only because it shows the soldier with the bended knee, but it also tells us where Gardner and his team were located as far as their darkroom. And then he moved his camera on the next image, which was image 256, ever so slightly to the right. And again, you can see the same photographs of the same dead soldiers, with the one that has the bended knee, and then in the distance you can see the photographer's darkroom wagon. I'm going to lift the camera just for reference. He had stated in his view it was near the Sherfy Peach Orchard, and if you look in the distance, right here in the distance, I am pointing at the Sherfy peach trees in the Sherfy Peach Orchard. And of course, that was the spot that Major General David Bell Birney and Dan Sickles advanced their troops away from the line that Meade had set for them and moved out in the front in the shape of a salient on July 2nd, 1863, in defense of the actions of Kershaw and Sims and Anderson's brigades that were coming through here toward the wheat field. So these two views give us clues as to the significance of the darkroom wagon of Gardner and where it was placed. This has been the Rose Farm Dead, Part 3. Dead, Part 4. We're going to take a look at 3 more views of Confederate dead here on the Gettysburg battlefield. After taking pictures of the darkroom wagon, The photographer then moved their camera over here into this direction, and they took 3 more views. And these 3 views were of the same dead Confederate soldiers. These dead Confederate soldiers were put into the shape of a V. The first view was taken from about this angle right here, and it was called Confederate Dead at the southwest edge of the Rose Woods, view looking northwest, O'Sullivan Gardner, view number 260, on July 5th of 1863. And that view depicts, again, a V formation right here. Then what they did was they moved the camera ever so slightly to our left into this position. Now as I move here, the ground drops off and then goes to the fence line not far from the split rock, which you can see this background in not only the split rock view with this southwest fence line here, or property line, but you can also see it in the view of the soldier with his entire midsection missing. The cameraman then moved his camera into this position right here and captured the next view. And this view is view number 227, also named Confederate Dead at the southwestern edge of the Rosewoods, view looking northward, O'Sullivan Gardner stereo view, July 5th and 6th of 1863. In this view, it's very interesting because you actually see in this view this rock over here and the larger rock behind it. It gives clues out to the location of where the photograph was taken. The cameraman had his camera right about here. But this time the V formation is directly facing the camera with the point of the V in this area. And again, in the distance, you can see up on the horizon the dark room wagon of O'Sullivan and Gardner. So this view is very important because it takes a different angle at the look of those soldiers in that V formation. And then the last view that we're going to take a look at is a group of the same soldiers, and it is view number 245, Confederate Dead at the southwestern edge of the Rosewood, view looking southeastward instead of view looking north toward the Sherfy peach orchard and the rose farm. We're going to look this way in the direction where we're at now. So the cameraman basically moved his camera over here, not far from this little boulder, on a slightly higher piece of flat ground, and then just simply turned his camera back where we took the 2 previous views and took image number 245 of this V formation. And you can actually notice this rock in the photograph, and of course the fence line, which is still here today, but not with a wooden fence. This has been the Rose Farm Dead, Part 4, and also a supplement to our Rose Farm video series. Okay, we are standing here on the Rose Farm. Now this property originally was owned by the Sherfy family. Back in 1844, it was sold to a man named Jacob Benner. Now, Benner was the legal guardian of 2 of Sherfy's grandsons. He purchased a 2-story stone house with a porch, an attached log building, a stone bank barn, a wagon shed, a corn crib, and a carriage house, a stone wash house, and a log stable. Now, on the farm here, there was an apple, peaches, pear orchards, and 140 acres of timber and a meadow. Now, Benner paid $5,316 for the 312 acres. Now, the Benner family removed the log building next to the farmhouse and replaced it with a 1.5-story stone unit, which began to show up in the 1852 tax records. Now, on March 22nd, 1858, a man named George and his wife, Dorothy Rose, of Germantown, Pennsylvania, bought this farm. At that time, it was 230 acres for $8,050. Now, George Rose was from Germantown, Pennsylvania, which is right on the Schuylkill River, just to the west side of Philadelphia. He was a 49-year-old butcher from Germantown, and he didn't take a permanent residence here until 1868. Now, his brother John, who was a grocer in the Philadelphia area, was the one that occupied the property during the Battle of Gettysburg. John claimed that he moved into the farmhouse on April the 1st, 1863, but another reference from 1859 shows that the people that may have been tenant farmers here was the Ogden family. Francis Ogden, his wife, and his son Charles were laborers, and they lived here on the Rose farm, maybe sharing the farmhouse with John Rose. Charles F. Ogden also inscribed his initials in one of the stones, which is still on the Rose farm today. Now, Charles F. Ogden actually was also a member of Captain John F. McCreary's Company B, 138th Pennsylvania Volunteers, which was a regiment right here from Gettysburg. As the war reached their home, there may have been up to 7 adults and 11 children living here at the Rose Farm. Now, of course, the Rose Farm, more popular today, is known for its after-battle death photos. And we're going to take a look at that and some other interesting facts about the Rose Farm here in another video. This has been part 1 of the Rose Farm part 2. Now, the Rose Farm was occupied during all 3 days of the Battle of Gettysburg. On July 1st of 1863, John Buford's Union Cavalry, after fighting near the Lutheran Theological Seminary, fell back to this farm here on the evening of July 1st. On July 2nd, Major General Dan Sickles moved forward as the Union Army took up a defensive position all around the Rose property. Ward's brigade was placed along Houck's Ridge, just south of the Rose property, and through the Rose Woods. D. Turban's brigade was in the Rose wheat field, where they were joined by Tilton's and Schweitzer's brigade. Graham's brigade selected a position in the Sherfy Peach Orchard, which shared the southern and eastern boundaries with the Rose property. McGilvery's artillery took up a position in the distance there along the Wheatfield Road. And at the northern boundary of the Rose property as well. Now, as Confederate soldiers launched their attacks on July 2nd, 1863, Anderson's, Kershaw's, Semmes brigades fought almost entirely on the Rose property as they crossed the Emmitsburg Road in this direction, fighting here on the Rose property and then beyond to the east of the house in areas such as the Bloody Wheatfield. Now, over 9,000 Confederate soldiers fought on the Rose property, with 1,807 of those becoming casualties of the war. Now, in addition to all the bloodshed, the Rose Farm suffered severe physical damage, and claims by Ogden John Rose and Mr. Ogden and George Rose went into the amounts of about $7,000, of course, which they were never able to recoup. There's not a whole lot of information that exists on the Rose family after the Battle of Gettysburg, except that George Rose had some financial difficulties, and just a few years after the Battle of Gettysburg, the house was lost. This has been the Rose Farm Part 2 on Gettysburg Battlefield. This is the Rose Farm Part 3, as well as Secrets of the Battlefield. In Part 1, we talked about the bank barn on the Rose Farm, part of the Rose Farm that the Sherfley family, who sold it to the Benner family and then finally to the Rose family, had. And this is what remains of that original bank barn. Early in the 1900s, the barn fell inward on itself, and this is all that remains of it today. One thing about this barn, however, today is secret to the battlefield is some rock carvings here. Over here, if you look on the wall, you'll see some rock carvings from HHW, and that is a man named Wirt, W-E-R-T. And the Wirt family may have been tenants here at this farm in the late 1800s, and it was, of course, John Wirt, who was here a early visitor right after the Battle of Gettysburg and collected a lot of relics on the Battle of Gettysburg here. And he wrote a lot of diary entries. And of course, those diary entries were again brought to life in Greg Coco's Strange and Blighted Land. And those rock carvings there are some original carvings from the late 1800s that still are on the foundation stones here of the Rose Barn. This has been the Rose Farm Part 3